Welcome to this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. This week we're going to talk about different equipment you can use while you're feeding your operation and how those things can help you. It's important to realize that every operation is going to be a little bit different, your feeding operation and how you do it. There's some things you've got to slow down and think about. Some of those things are, how big is your herd? Are you feeding a handful of cows or are you feeding 200 head of cows? Depending on your size, there's lots of things you may need to do a little bit differently. Think about what kind of equipment do you have. Do you have things like troughs where you can be feeding on the ground? Do you have your cows in a place that a J-bunk system might work for you? And as you think about your equipment needs, it's also important to think about what kind of storage do you have. Do you have a place to store bulk feed, or are you going to be buying bagged feed? Do you have what you need to make that happen? Think about the time commitment. Are you able to feed every day? Are you going to be feeding every other day? Or are these cows that may be on a lease place that you see once a week? Depending on how often you can feed can make a big difference as well. Depending on how often you can feed can make a big difference as well. Another thing to take into account is what can you handle? Can you handle hauling 8 50-pound sacks around every day? Do you need to think about things like a cake feeder possibly? The other thing to take into account is what kind of hay quality came back on your hay test. Are you going to be supplementing with a little feed or a lot of feed? So let's get started. As we talk about winter feeding, one of the most important things is that we maximize the efficiency of our hay. We talked a little bit last week about how important it is to hay test. So once you have that hay test, you know the quality of hay you're feeding and you know how much you need to be feeding as far as how many pounds of it per day. If you're going out once a week and putting out enough round bales for the week on the ground, the chances that you're wasting hay is really high. So there's lots of different things we can do to maximize that hay efficiency. One of those is starting with is how much are you putting out at a time? The more often we put hay out in smaller amounts, the more likely they are to eat it rather than waste as much. In this example that you see in the picture, they put a bale out the first day, and then the second day they come back and unroll whatever's left and put up this electric fence wire so the cows can get in to clean up what's left and maybe not trample it as much. Maybe polywire is not an option at your place, so maybe you're looking more at just unrolling hay and feeding every day or every other day. That way they're able to eat as much of it as they can and not waste nearly as much. One of the things you can do to minimize waste is unroll your hay. You're feeding hay a little bit more often, but your cows are less likely to waste it. This can be a good option if you don't have hay rings or something like that to work with. We always take the net wrap off whenever we feed hay. This is a handy bale trailer that makes it easier for us to put hay out at some of our lease places so we don't have to haul a tractor everywhere we go. Benefits of feeding hay by unrolling it is it spreads some of your nutrients across your field rather than all in one place. This also spreads your traffic across your field. In another video, we'll talk about how strategically feeding your hay can really help maximize your potential nutrients in your soil as well. Having a good terrain can also be effective. As you can see here, it's really easy to unroll it because we're headed downhill. There's also equipment you can use to help unroll hay as well. There's lots of different options out there. There's also hay rings, and a lot of people really like hay rings. Anything that gets it up off the ground where they're not trampling in it, they're not bedding in it, can make a major difference in your hay waste. I really like the panels that are on the bottom of these two hay rings. That way it helps keep the bottom of your hay a little bit cleaner. Your cows aren't getting in there as much, and maybe they won't waste as much in the long run. Another perk to hay rings is you can move these around in your fields and feed your hay more strategically and kind of put some nutrients back in your soil that we can talk about on a different note another day. So when it comes to our supplemental feeds that we're putting out with our hay, it's important that you have a plan for how you're going to feed those things. Think about your operation and what works. Do you have the option to put some concrete bunks out in your pasture that you can feed in regularly? Or if you're more of a lot style system, a lot of people really like these J bunks that are featured on the right. You've got a trough that makes a J shape, so it means this side on the left is a little bit shorter than the side on the right. And there's some kind of fence rail that goes above it that's on the side the cows are on inside their lot. They can come up and eat out of it. There's a taller side on your road or outside of your fence where you could drive down and fill these bunk feeders from the outside. This eliminates some of your mess if you're worried about getting mauled by your cattle. If you've got cows like ours that as soon as they see a feed bag, they're getting in the middle of it. These are some things that can make things a little safer at your operation and maybe a little bit easier on you if that's an option. So with those, lots of times, especially those J-bunk style systems, we see more of the grinders and mixers or something that can be fed out the side used more regularly. On the left, you see a tractor that's putting that round bale into some kind of grinder. This is a good option, especially if you have lower quality hay or you're afraid your cows aren't as likely to eat as much of it. This breaks their hay down into smaller chunks. It mixes it in with their feed and is also a big help in eliminating that waste factor. On the right, you see the tractor pulling that mixer wagon and putting the feed out straight into the J-bunks. This is a good option once all your feed's mixed in there and can be a little bit easier to feed your cattle if you have this kind of equipment. Sometimes we're feeding out in the pasture and sometimes that's on the ground. This is where cubes can be an option for your operation. It's just important when you think back to last week when we talked about supplemental feeding that you know what your hay is so you know how many pounds of cubes you need to be putting out or if that's an option to reach your herd's needs. This is a cube box that can go on the back of a side-by-side. I've seen people put them on their tractors. There's all kinds of agriculture engineering operations and ideas out there that could work for you. Sometimes you're putting bags in the back of your truck and you're walking the field and putting them out by hand. These can be options. These cake boxes can make life a little bit easier. Then there's self-feeders. Sometimes you're buying your feed in bulk. You're filling up a feeder kind of like this, and it's just going to stay out in your pasture and your cows can come eat at it at will. Lots of times if you tell them what you're doing with a self-feeder, they can put a limiting factor in there like salt to kind of slow your cows down so they're not eating too much at one time. If you are using a self-feeder, it's really important that you monitor how much feed you're going through. That way, not only are you knowing you're reaching your cow's requirements, but you might not be hurting your checkbook as bad that way either. Storage is the next factor you have to think about. How are you planning on storing the feed that you're going to be feeding your cattle this winter? Do you have some kind of commodity shed that's featured here where maybe even your hay, there's a place for you to put your feed as it comes in? Maybe you have one of these feed bins that you can auger feed out of. Whoever delivers your feed can come with their auger truck, fill it up, and you can get out as much as you need at a time. Maybe you're buying bagged feed and stacking it in a barn somewhere. Maybe storage is a big problem, so you're only buying as much feed as you can feed at a time. Think about this as you're planning your feeding options for this year. If you've got more questions, as always, don't be afraid to come by the office or give me a call. This is the link to our website that talks about nutrition and feeding. We'd love to help you out, but don't be afraid to give us a call.